It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. When they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 116th season of the Empire Club of Canada. I am Mike Van Sol, and I'm the president of the Empire Club, and I'm delighted to host you for today's virtual event titled How to Respond to an Economic Crisis, Softening the Blow of COVID-19. I call this meeting to order. As many of you know, we here at the Empire Club of Canada love tradition. Normally at this point, we would be toasting the Queen and raffling off a bottle of wine. But after 116 years of meeting in person, of being addressed by speakers from our podium, today it is my honor to welcome each of you and our panelists to our first ever virtual event. From my home to yours, welcome. It is a brave new world out there, and our sudden launch into the virtual realm is only one example of the countless ways COVID-19 is changing the way we live and work. It seemed fitting that our first virtual event should deal with the pandemic, and specifically the economic impact it will have both domestically and internationally. As we enter into uncertain and uneasy economic times, it is clear the pandemic will leave no business untouched. Governments have scrambled to respond with a stimulus that dwarfs the response to the 2018 financial crisis. Will it work? And where do we go from here? Joining us to answer these very questions is a distinguished panel. But before I introduce them, I wanted to give our viewers a few quick tips on making today's experience a great one. If you find your feed is lagging at all, please try setting your bandwidth option to low. This should improve the audio quality. You can also adjust the volume by using the 6 bars at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Another change we've embraced is that instead of ticket sales, we've encouraged you to consider making a donation to the United Way. They've launched a local love fund in response to the crisis. The fund will help some of our community's most vulnerable friends and neighbors get the supports that they need. With that said, we have a terrifically smart lineup for you today. I'm pleased to welcome Tiff Macklem, the Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. He is joined by former CPP IB CEO and BlackRock executive Mark Wiseman. Rounding out the group is the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Hassan Yussuff. Today's conversation will be moderated by Elena Cherney, the editor of news features and special projects at the Wall Street Journal. So with that, over to you, Elena.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to start by asking each of you what you see in terms of the shorter-term economic fallout, perhaps the rest of the year, and how that will play out in Canada and the world. Tiff, can we start with you? Can you give us a sense? How much worse do you see this economic contraction getting, and what shape will the rebound take?
Well, thanks, Elena, I think, for letting me go first. But more seriously, thanks to the Empire Club for hosting this. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Mark and Hassan has to say and everybody's questions. Look, the grim reality is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that creates a foreboding feeling. But we are going to get through this. There are a lot of questions. How much worse is it going to get? How long is it going to last? And what sort of permanent economic damage are we going to experience? For Canada, there's really a double whammy. We've got the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also seen a stunning collapse in oil prices. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the duration of both of those. Let me just focus though on COVID-19. There are a few things that are very clear amidst a lot of uncertainty. First of all, our economy is already shrinking. We're already in recession, but this is not like a normal business cycle recession. COVID-19 it's more like a natural disaster that's engulfing the whole world, and we're deliberately restricting activity in large parts of our economy to limit the spread of the virus. The second thing that's really clear is that you can't restrict large parts of the economy and stimulate it at the same time. So right now, we really have to focus on emergency relief. We have to build a bridge to help businesses and households get to the other side of this, and we have to do it very fast. The good news in Canada is we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in Canada. We have the capacity. Now's the time to use it. The third thing that's really clear is that we are going to see a decline in economic activity that is unprecedented in its suddenness. And in the next weeks, you're going to see gobsmacking economic numbers come out, and those are going to get a lot of headlines. But to be honest, they're not going to be very informative. If you deliberately restrict activity in large parts of your economy, if you have an unprecedented restriction in economic activity in your economy, you're going to see an unprecedented decline in economic activity. And I could give you some numbers, but as I say, I don't think they're going to be that informative. What is going to be important is sort of what goes from there. And that's going to depend a lot on the evolution of the virus. And if you look at the pandemic experts, my colleague, for example, Vivek Goel at University of Toronto, what they'll tell you is with effective social distancing, stay-at-home behavior, and lots of testing, in 4 to 6 weeks, you can flatten the curve. So, Canada, we're in this for we've been doing this now for a couple of weeks. We've been social distancing and stay at home for a couple of weeks. We are going to need a lot more testing, but let's be optimistic. We flatten the curve by through April. So by the end of April, there's not too many new cases. I think in that scenario, you would see government start to lift restrictions sometime in May. But my message here is that it's not going to be a rapid snap back to normal. I think what the experts are telling us is that there'll be new pockets of the virus. It might be in pockets. It might be more generalized. You're probably going to see some reimposition of restrictions. Different sectors are going to come back at different speeds. You can imagine international air travel is going to be one of the last things to come back. This back to work is going to be stop-start. It's going to be uneven. Hopefully, if this goes well, by the third quarter, we start to restart the economy. By fourth quarter, it should be in full swing. We should see some big quarterly growth numbers. I'll just finish by saying, we're going to spend a lot of time, I think, talking about the emergency response. But the other thing we really need to be thinking, companies and governments need to be right now thinking about the back to work plan. Companies need to be thinking about, okay, how are we going to get our workers back and work safely? How do we be nimble in flipping between remote and at work? How do we serve our customers safely? How do we deal with our supply chain? And from government side, it's clear we're going to need a lot more testing. This drive-through testing in Korea has proved to be very effective. We're going to need lots of protective equipment, not just for healthcare workers, absolutely first priority, but we're also going to need it for the workplace. Telemedicine for home care, social tracking. I guess the bottom line is the most important thing is we need to halt the virus. That's, the longer the virus goes, the more the economy is going to be affected. But we also need to be thinking about how do we ramp up the economy in a way that minimizes reemergence of the virus.
Thank you. We want to delve back into some of these back to work plans and exit strategies a little bit later. But I want to hear first, Hassan, from a labor market perspective, what does this all mean? What does this mean in terms of employment? What does this mean in terms of workers and over the next couple of months? Give us a sense of how this, and do you agree with the scenario and the timing around May in terms of the lifting of measures?
Well, first, let me start by thanking all the people on the front lines right now that are doing everything they can to keep us safe, but equally to provide the services that we all need. I think many of these people, for the most part, we would never even notice them in the past, but now they mean so much in our lives. Cleaners, the person who bag your grocery at the grocery store, and of course, all the other services that we're relying upon. But I think it's important for us to recognize that, because without these people, the things that we are taking today for granted, even though we're safe in our home, the electricity grid is still operating because those workers are going to work. For those who are still requiring public transit to get to work, public transit workers are still out there doing their jobs. So our journalists, of course, are doing their part to make sure we stay informed as to what's going on at the end of the day. I can go on a list, but more importantly, the people in the healthcare system who are on the front lines and recognizing this is, of course, what they've signed up to, and more importantly, are doing whatever they need to do. At the same time, while some of them, of course, are getting infected, they realize they got to show up to work to continue to help us to ensure we can actually stem the trend of this virus. More importantly, I think I want to say to our members and to all workers out there, we need to, of course, heed healthcare officials and take their warnings very, very seriously. Social distance is important, but more importantly, we need to practice that. But for workers right now, no matter what sector of the economy you're in, the big worry is, am I going to be laid off? Am I going to be, of course, a furlough? And more importantly, where is my income going to come from at the end of the day in regard to supporting my family, to pay my bills? So what the federal government have done, and of course, some of this, of course, are slowly rolling it out, and we're seeing the impact, I think, instantaneously. Of course, the emergency benefit that the federal government brought in, it's going to make sure everybody, of course, who are self-employed to those who are unemployed right now, whether they're furloughed or unemployed, are going to get a benefit. And of course, that's equivalent to $2,000 per month. So that's going to give people some stability. They're going to get some income. Of course, the most recent announcement, and yesterday the Prime Minister, of course, have broadened, of course, the scope of the wage subsidy, which is going to provide at least 75% of wage subsidy for small, large employers and medium-sized employers across the country. So there's no reason for an employer to actually lay anybody off. They can actually use the wage subsidy to keep people on their payroll. These are workers, of course, they have invested enormous amount of money in training them over time. And more importantly, workers going to need some attachment to their workplace, because when we do come out of this crisis, they want to make sure and want to know they're going to go back to work at the end of the day. But the stress and the worries that workers are going through, of course, is how long is this going to last? And more importantly, when are we going to go back to work? Right now, I don't think we have a clear answer. We're hoping, as Tiff has suggested, this may be early in May that workers are going to start returning to work. And more importantly, of course, the challenge is going to be what demands are for them to provide in regard to how strong the economy is, and more importantly, how many workers are going to go back to work at the beginning of May or early May, and more importantly, how quick can we get out of this crisis? And I think most of that is unknown right now, knowing fully well that our economy is very integrated with the Americans, and depends on how quick the Americans, of course, are able to fight the virus and, of course, reduce the infection rate, because our domestic consumption is very limited, and more importantly, that's not going to reboot the Canadian economy to the level it was at before, of course, this crisis. Going forward, there's much more we can do, and of course, I'll leave that as there may be questions that might provide me an opportunity to answer other questions that might come at the end of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, we do want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask questions. I believe there is a way for you to send your questions to a queue. We will look at those questions and leave time for questions and answers toward the end of the conversation, but please do take the time to think of your questions and put them in the queue. Mark, let's ask you, there's obviously a big part of this conversation is about the uncertainty. We're hearing from both Hassan and Tiff that there may be some potential for starting to lift lockdowns in Canada, potentially in May, and people going back to work. What does that mean for markets, and what should investors be thinking about?
Well, thanks, Elena, and thanks to the Empire Club for hosting us today, and thanks to all of you for supporting the United Way as part of this event. There's a great deal of uncertainty here, but but there's one thing that is clear. And what is clear is that this will come to an end. It doesn't feel that way today as the number of cases increases, as the number of deaths increase. But each time we've been in a type of crisis like this, whether it's the global financial crisis, 9/11, the oil shock, the Spanish flu just over 100 years ago, the crisis does come to an end and the economy and markets rebound. And so in the depths of this, we have to ensure as investors and as business leaders that we know in the back of our mind that this will come to an end. The big question is, when does it come to an end? And part of the problem about that question, and Hassan alluded to it a little bit in his answer, is that this is indeed a global pandemic. This is not a natural disaster that has just affected our geography or another geography around the world. It is truly a global issue. And so even if we are able to do better than some jurisdictions in terms of controlling the spread, it really matters is how is the world going to respond overall. And from an investor's point of view, the economy is so interlinked, it's so important that we think about this on the from a global perspective, even for domestic companies in Canada, because we are a global economy now. And so even if we are coming out of this in the back end, if other major economies are not, we are all in this together. And that's one issue that I've got to date in terms of the response. The response has been localized. The response has tended to be a focus on what are the Italians doing in Italy? What are the Germans doing in Germany? What are Canadians doing in Canada? I do think we have to think about the impact that this is going to have globally. When it started, we were all worried about supply chains. We were worried about, boy, are we going to be able to get the goods that we need, the components that we need from China? And so we had this sort of global perspective, but as this has affected more and more countries, it's become much more insular. And in terms of our thinking, and I think for an investor, we can't just focus on the US, we can't just focus on Canada. We just have to look at how the entire world is responding and recovering. So I'm probably less optimistic than maybe Tiff and Hassan are in terms of when we really do and how long this takes before we do come back. But I do believe, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 18 months, the global economy will come back with a tremendous amount of strength. There's going to be a tremendous amount of pent-up demand. And we've seen this time and again. People always say, well, the world's changed. No one's going to get on an airplane again. No one's going to want to travel again. Well, we've seen in the past, after 9/11, for example, that air travel 6 months later was back to pre-9/11 levels. So the economy will come back. The question is when and how much of that, how much we're going to be able to mitigate this on a global perspective, not just here, because that's got to be a big part of the answer in terms of how Canada fares.
So let's look at how Canada's faring and the Canadian response on a monetary and fiscal level. A couple of you have alluded to how global this situation is. Tiff, I think you called it more like a natural disaster engulfing the whole world. And Mark, you just also made a reference to the global nature. How do the Canadian measures measure up? Are they adequate? Is this enough to stave off? To what degree can economic collapse be mitigated here? Who wants to take that, Tiff, if you want to?
Why don't you start and I'll jump in after.
Workers are so much at the center of this.
Sorry, workers are so much at the center of this?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, let Hassan go first. I'm happy to go after Hassan.
Well, I think two quick points. One, of course, give you a little bit of perspective. Before the crisis, what we were dealing with, 2 out of 5 workers live from paycheck to paycheck. So any disruption in that reality for any worker in this country is a disaster. If they miss one paycheck, it means that mortgage payments, paying their bills, are not going to be met. And of course, in addition to that, before we got into this crisis, of course, the debt ratio is 0.75 for every dollar the worker is making in this country, and that's incredibly high. And that's without, of course, everybody now being either laid off, furlough, or of course going to be jobless. So it's a huge challenge, I think, in terms of the reality, what people are worrying about. More importantly, of course, is how do we mitigate this? I think the two measures that governments have brought in have the potential, of course, is to smoothness out, to keep, of course, people getting some income, but more importantly, ensuring at the tail end of this, as we come out of this, that there's an ability for workers, of course, to get back to work as quickly if their employers are prepared to put them back on the payroll, but equally the opportunity for them to spend, because if their debt ratio is going to increase beyond 1.75, I think this economy and the recession is going to be much longer and much deeper going forward.
I think you had a comment.
Yeah. I'll just add a couple of things. I think, first of all, as Hassan has underlined, the government of Canada has moved really quite quickly and has continued to layer on different emergency relief measures. I would underline here that it's going to be really important in the implementation of these things that they keep it pretty simple. This is emergency relief. It's got to be, we're in the emergency. It's got to get delivered really quickly. So that means, the way you apply to this has to be pretty simple. There's going to be a real minimum of due diligence, and people are just going to have to make attestations. They're going to have to be trusted, and then eventually, in the fullness of time, it can be audited out the back. But we're going to have to trust people going through the front door. The other element is, there's a huge premium on execution, and for the public service, to scale up these programs and stand up new programs in the space of weeks has never been done before. They're going to need some help from the private sector here. The other thing I'd stress, sort of coming more to the financial side, is that if you go back to 2008, global financial crisis, the financial system was the problem. We saw a huge tightening in financial conditions that pulled the economy down. This time, the financial system can actually be part of the solution. It can be a shock absorber. It can defer. There's banks have brought forward programs to defer mortgages. Companies need to go to their banks and draw on their credit lines. They need to get cash to tie them through to the other side of this. And for that to work, the financial system needs two things. It needs capital and it needs funding or liquidity. It's got lots of capital. We've built up big capital buffers in the last 10 years in the financial system in Canada and globally. Now's the time to use them. In Canada, OSFI's taken off this thing called the domestic stability buffer. That's going to create a lot of billions, something like $300 billion of new lending capacity. That's helpful. The other thing that's needed is funding. In order for a bank to be able to defer a mortgage, in order to be able to loan to individuals, in order to loan to businesses to tie them through this, they need to be able to fund those. They need to be able to fund those loans. And so that's where the Bank of Canada providing liquidity and keeping core funding markets operating smoothly and keeping spreads from rising too much is very important. And last Friday, I was very pleased to see them come in with a series of programs. They have a banker's acceptance purchasing program, a commercial paper purchasing program, a short-term provincial paper purchasing program. These are like the essential services of the financial system. These are core funding markets, and it's really important to keep those, keep credit flowing through those so that companies can fund themselves directly, and banks can, keep funding credit flowing. And then the other piece is the Insured Mortgage Purchase Program, which the government through CMHC is buying insured mortgages off the balance sheets of banks. That's potentially $150 billion program. This program, we did it first in the global financial crisis. It proved to be very effective. And it's a way to get term funding to banks so they can continue to make term lending. You can't do a 5-year mortgage with 1-year funding. You need match funding. This is 5-year money. And so being able to deploy that, learn from the past crisis and deploy that rapidly is going to be helpful. So, these aren't these things are kind of the plumbing of the financial system, but just to say that if the tools are there, and if we can get this to work well, the financial system can support the economy through this.
Mark, do you think those tools are adequate, or is there a risk that the financial system itself could become part of the problem, which some people have highlighted? Are you comfortable that that risk is being mitigated?
Yeah, so I just sort of make 3 points here. The first point is I think the government and the Bank of Canada have responded out of the gate incredibly well. And we've had a lot, particularly on the monetary side, as Tiff, I think, correctly states, we have a lot of lessons that have been well learned from 08. And 08 has really helped us here because we have ample liquidity in the system. We've responded quickly. And I think whether it's on the fiscal side or on the monetary side, this is my first point, what the government has done to date has been to act quickly, get the programs out there, whether it's something that the CMHC is doing or on the employment side, wage subsidies. We'll work out the details later. We'll pivot. We'll adjust. But let's get things done and let's focus on quick and effective execution. So I give the government and the central bank in this country very, very high marks for getting things out the door fast. But I want to remind them that being able to adjust and pivot and execute is at the end of the day what's important. Second point is that the private sector has to be more integrated into this. If we are in some form of a war footing here, government alone will not get this done. Government alone will not get this implemented. And there needs to be a partnership like we frankly have not seen since the Second World War between the private sector and the public sector working together economically, whether it's on the healthcare side for testing, PPE, ventilators, but also more generally. We need to think about this as a holistic response. It's not just about the government and it's not just about the private sector. We've got to get the two pieces working much, much more closely together to address the issues that are going to face us both economically and epidemiologically. And I don't see enough of that taking place yet, and I don't see us being well organized yet. So I think that's going to be critically important. Third, we also have to start thinking about how we're going to win the peace and positioning ourselves for when we do come out of this. And a great example of that is keeping employees employed. So that's why wage subsidies were so important to come out with, because the frictional cost, you can imagine if everybody gets laid off in the whole economy, and now we're coming out of this and we want to restart and everybody changes jobs, the frictional costs associated with that would be massive. So keeping our employees employed and the government creating the means to do that. So when we do ramp up, the know-how is there. There isn't retraining. There isn't this massive friction and sand in the gears as we want to get the economic engine restarted. So those are the three things that I think are critically important. Continue to move quickly, adjust later, integrate the public sector and the private sector much more formally in the system. And then third is start thinking about how we win the peace, not just the war.
So as we talk about winning the peace and thinking about what an exit looks like, let's come back to this, which all of you have touched on earlier. It's not going to happen overnight. And actually, before I go to you all with this question, I want to remind our audience that we are going to be taking questions. You should have a prompt on your screen, so please do send us some questions, and we'll go to you in a little while. Let's talk a little bit about that exit and unwinding some of these measures. How do different jurisdictions, particularly as this plays out and the curves play out at different speeds in different parts of the world, and as we've talked about, very integrated world, how do Canadian policymakers start to lift these measures? And when do they know? How do they know that it's safe to start letting people to go back to work? How do workers know that it's safe to go back? How do businesses function in that environment? What does that normalization look like? Mark, you're nodding. Do you want to start with?
Well, I think there's a simple, and it's economists and investors talk about this idea of animal spirits. But ultimately, it's about confidence. People have to have confidence. First and foremost, they have to have confidence that they're going to be safe. Nobody wants to, you can lift all the restrictions you want, but if you don't feel safe, you're not going to go back to work unless you're forced to. And we don't want anybody to be in that position, forced to do so economically or forced to do so for some other reason. So we have to ensure that people feel safe, that they feel safe to go back to their offices and their factories and to go back to their jobs. If people feel safe, the next thing that'll happen is that people will begin to have confidence. They'll begin to have confidence that they're going to have the next paycheck. They'll begin to have confidence that they can begin to spend again, and that will get the economic wheels in motion. But people have to feel safe. People have to feel confident. People have to feel that the worst of this is behind them. And until that happens, nothing will really start going in the economy. You could reopen all the restaurants in Toronto tomorrow. My bet is that they would still be empty. And my bet is that most servers and workers wouldn't be comfortable going in to do their job. So we have to make people feel safe and confident, and that will, at the end of the day, drive the economy. I think we're a long way from that, unfortunately.
Hassan, what's your view? Are we a long way from that?
I think so. I think, again, I think we expect the numbers to go up in terms of people that's infected. And I think as long as that continue to climb, I don't think anybody's going to want to leave the sanctuary of their own space, home or apartment or whatever, to go back to work. Secondly, of course, we've got to be able to rely heavily on our health officials telling us that whenever this curve is flattened, actually it is flattened. So if we don't go back to work, we're not going to end up repeating the problems we were trying to solve in the first place, that people get reinfected. And more importantly, of course, we're continuing to fight this virus. I think what we have learned from China, the shutdown was massive. It was draconian. But what they were able to do, at least from what we're able to read and learn, is that they did able to flatten the curve, to be able to return to some normalcy. And we're seeing that happening right now. Of course, we don't know what our statistics look like 3 weeks from today or 4 weeks from today, but I think that is going to tell a huge story. Canadians seems to be trusting, of course, our health officials for the information they're getting from them. I'm hoping, of course, that's reliable. And more importantly, of course, workers themselves are very scared. They're very worried that, of course, majority of workers don't have the ability to have self-protection when they go to work. So they're going to have to rely on the goodwill that they're going back to work and their colleagues are not infected, of course, and they're not going to get infected from simply going back to their job at the end of the day.
So I just want to add one thing to that. Sorry, Ellen, I just want to add one thing to that, which is that what Hassan says actually is just yet another reason why testing and data is so important here. And one of my big worries, and I'm not an expert in this, but one of my big worries is that we're not doing enough testing. We're not ramping up the testing fast enough. And we're not in a position to make these types of decisions with reliable data. We've seen that the jurisdictions that have been most successful have had massive and extremely widespread and broad testing measures in place. We have to make that a big focus, not just to protect people, but also to put ourselves in a position where policymakers can make decisions based on real data, and then people will continue to have confidence in them and allow the economy to come back. So testing is really important from a healthcare perspective and an epidemiological perspective, but it's also incredibly important from an economic perspective.
But that's very interesting, because what we seem to be saying here is that we expect policymakers here to rely on the best available epidemiological data in order to make decisions about when to lift lockdowns, whereas we're actually seeing much more of a debate in the U.S. and in jurisdictions within the U.S. over whether or not these lockdowns are economically viable. Tiff, do you want to speak to that difference at all and why we see the consensus?
I think this there is a debate here about the economic costs, but I think the way we need to be thinking about it is, how do we design return to work in a way that really minimizes the reintroduction, the respreading of the virus? As Mark and Hassan said, a key priority is we need widely accessible, rapid testing. We need really good social tracking. so that, when pockets inevitably emerge, we can, shut that down and isolate the pocket quickly, so that we don't get back into more widespread generalized resurgence, which will then require more generalized restrictions on the economy, which will then get us back to where we are right now. If I can, it's not about the economy or the virus. Like we're not going to fix the economy until we deal with the virus, but we need to figure out ways to do both better. If I can push it out a little bit, I think, as I said, companies are going to need a really detailed plan about how are they going to get workers back to work safely? How are they going to serve customers safely? Looking a little bit beyond the next few months, I think companies also need to think about, experts say it's going to take about 18 months till we get we can immunize against this. We can get a vaccine. So you can expect, even over that whole period, this thing's going to be reverberating around the world. Supply chains are going to be disrupted. Travel is going to be disrupted. There may be periods where you have to flip back to remote. You may need to deliver to customers in different ways. So companies need to kind of imagine a new normal for the next 18 months where the economy is ramping back up, but it's bumpy. And how are they going to work in that? And then I think from the government point of view, they're going to need to start to think about, as these emergency relief measures come off, they're going to have to shift to sort of more traditional economic stimulus. And so that gets you into things like infrastructure spending, for example. The reason infrastructure spending is so good for stimulus is it has a very large fiscal multiplier. For every dollar you spend, you get more than $1 of stimulus in the economy. It ripples through the economy. So, what are the big infrastructure projects that we could do? Is this an opportunity to, invest in cleaner growth? Is this, what are some big nation building projects? This is coming pretty quickly. We need to be starting to think about those things. You can't just take the relief off and replace it with nothing. You're going to need some stimulus.
And to even get any of this going, to start to really think about going back to work, just to go back to Mark's point, knowing where we're at, in other words, testing, being able to monitor people's health and know whether we're facing outbreaks again. Is that a prerequisite? Much broader testing?
I think it has to be, because otherwise we're flying blind. And, several people have made this point in editorials this week, but I just think we can't make decisions, and people will not feel confident.
Yeah.
Unless there's good data. So it all rolls in together. And I think that's got to be a major focus. And we're very uneven in this country as well. I mean, it's just the nature of federalism. I think we've probably got people on this webcast from across the country, but we're also very uneven between jurisdictions. And I'd encourage the federal government to play that convening role to try and make sure that we're applying the same standards from province to province, because today it differs in Quebec and in Alberta and Ontario and BC and elsewhere. And so we need a real national effort on the testing front.
I think one of the things also too, Elena, if I could say, that is going to be quite, I think, pronounced as things got back to somewhat semi-normal. People are going to want to know that they have protective equipment, and I think masks are going to have to be much broadly available for people to access, because even though the statistics may tell us one thing, people are not going to be certain until they know for sure. And a lot more workers are going to want to have protective equipment if they're going to be asked to go to work, because they want to ensure they're going to protect their health. One of the other things we didn't talk about much today is, of course, what do you do with the kids that's got to go back to school, that right now are in social isolation? And at some point, we're going to have to figure out, how does these kids get to complete their education, whether it's in primary or public school, and how do we bring the education system back to normal, where these kids can actually have the access, of course, to complete their education. And that, I know that there's a lot of homeschooling going on, but at some point, we've got millions of kids in a country that are not getting a proper education because they're not able to access their teachers and their regular classroom at the same time.
I'd love an answer to that one. I'd like to start going to some of the audience questions. We have some really good questions coming in. I don't know where they're coming. I don't have names on these questions, and I don't know, where in the country you are, but I'll just try to pick a sampling. We've got somebody asking about the price of oil, which I think was mentioned early on in the discussion. With the price of oil getting hurt by both supply and demand issues, how worried are you? This isn't for anyone in particular, but how worried are you about the impact this will have for the Canadian oil industry and long-term for the Canadian economy? Can we address the impact of commodities prices?
I can start on that. I'm very worried. WTI is something like $20. WCS, Western Canada Select, which is the price that many Canadian producers, I just checked before I came onto this, under $5. These are completely unsustainable prices. There's two things going on here. Fundamentally, there's with such a big contraction in economic activity, particularly things like airlines that use a lot of fuel, there's a giant decline in demand. And then at the same time, there's a price war between the Saudis and Russia. The price war, perhaps that can get worked out. The U.S. needs to sit down with these players and come to some sort of rational. This is not the time to be piling onto a crisis, and countries need to work together to solve this, not take advantage of the situation for their own purposes. So hopefully that can get worked out. But the collapse in demand, that is going to take some time. There's going to be a massive buildup of inventories. So we're probably looking at, I don't think prices as low as they are now, but probably for the next couple of years, oil prices are going to be lower than we expected. That's a long time, and so the government has done a lot. There's a couple things. There's going to need to be some sort of significant rescue package for the oil and gas sector in Canada. We're going to need something for the airline industry, this is a big problem for the oil producing regions, particularly Alberta, but it's a big problem for Canada. Our biggest export is oil and gas. The stuff that we export to global markets is now worth a lot less. That means there's a lot less money coming into the country. And as Hassan and Mark have emphasized, this is a global pandemic, and how it plays out globally is going to affect the global price of oil, not just what we do in Canada.
Yeah, and this is probably economically the biggest single issue facing the country right now, because it is a double or triple whammy. So it's obviously the issue around the pandemic, but it's also the price war that Tiff has alluded to, and it doesn't just affect oil production. It's going to affect our ability, for example, to build pipelines because they're just not economical. And then we're going to have the problem when the price inevitably does rebound as supply comes off. First of all, you're not going to have any confidence to spend capital. And you're also not going to, again, we're going to be faced with the same problem we've had, which is we're going to have no way of getting our product in the future to market because we won't have had the capital to build the pipelines. So this is a really, really tough nut to crack. And I agree with Tiff that we have to make sure that we don't take our eye off the ball and be thinking long term. And long term, we still have to find a way to get that resource to market, both oil and gas. And I want to make sure that in all of this, Tiff, you talked about infrastructure build and you talked about nation building projects. That may very well be a pipeline or a series of pipelines.
Okay,
and
this is
if we don't do that now, yeah. We're going to be in the same. 10 years from now, we'll be having the same debate.
So this is a good segue to a couple of questions have come in on the point about public and private action to partnerships and systems. What kinds of things, Mark, you spoke about this, I think, Tiff, you may have mentioned, what kinds of projects, what kinds of initiatives are you thinking about when you talk about public and private, and why is that partnership important?
Well, I'll start quickly. I just think this is just, we have, again, it's not the perfect analogy, but we're sort of on a bit of a war footing here. And when you're on a war footing, the government can't do it all and the private sector can't do it all. They have to work together. And, we're not building tanks or armored personnel carriers. Thankfully, we're building ventilators and personal protective equipment. But that type of thing requires the public sector and the private sector to come together in a much more organized way than we are used to. And so, I would argue that we have to think about how, and we have good lessons in history, how this has been done well, how we can come together, be much less ad hoc, much more organized, with a view that this is going to go on for months, if not more. And we have to figure out how we're going to work together to do this. To date, and again, it's early days, and we're just getting up to speed. But to date, it's been ad hoc in terms of the public sector and the private sector. Everybody's trying to do their best. Everybody is well intentioned. Everybody is moving fast. Now is the time to organize ourselves for a longer period of time.
So we're talking about potentially building necessary equipment, supplying necessary equipment, medical equipment, ventilators, PPE equipment. Hassan or Tiff, I think what some of these folks are asking, there are 3 or 4 questions about this. What is the mechanism for creating that partnership? Is there a way to do it? Who gets involved? I mean, is there a way to do that quickly and make it happen?
Well, I think the government needs to start planning for that eventuality because it's coming. As Morneau has said when he outlined his financial package, that this was phase 1 of what he was contemplating, and there was a phase 2 and a phase 3. I think they need to start thinking about what are we going to do here, and what are some of the issues we want to tackle, given what this crisis of course afforded us. I mean, as we know, going into this crisis, there was a huge debate about the climate crisis that we were struggling with. I think this is an opportunity for the government to say, okay, what can we do to advance that effort? And more importantly, where can we invest that's going to benefit the country into the long term? Because these are things we're going to have to do, given our commitment to 2050 and reducing our greenhouse gases. How do we make some of those investments at a time when the country is going to need that infrastructure at the city level to improve the public transit system? And how do we bring both industry, business, and cities together to talk about how that can happen at a massive scale, but also using some public funds that's going to help generate the jobs, but also going to generate, of course, some demands for the product that it can be produced at the same time. The one point I also want to make, the governments also have to start thinking, which I think they're already doing. There are going to need to be some specific approaches to particular industry. Right now, we know the airline industry is suffering enormously, and the government is going to have to come up with a rescue package. What does that package look like? And more importantly, how does it ensure that the workers who are working in that industry are going to have meaningful jobs at the end of the day as they support the sector to ensure they have the financial support, they can weather the storm, but equally come out of this, that they can get back into business at the end of the day and keep their workforce intact, and more importantly, provide some good jobs in those sectors that already exist in this economy.
I have a question here about the guaranteed income. This person asks, as we think about some of our most vulnerable populations, is this the time for guaranteed income to provide a platform launch for all Canadians to recover after COVID-19?
I think it would be. I think that the debate we need to have with the provinces and the city as to how to reform the social safety net going to require some understanding, because right now, of course, we allow people to go on social assistance or unemployment insurance if they can get it. And I think there were some good articles speaking about the need for us to do this. Hugh Siegel, a former senator, of course, now at Queen's University, is a strong advocate, has been saying this is an opportunity for us to consider that, but it will require the federal government working this out with the province. The province can't do this on their own. They require the federal government to be a partner, but certainly I think would be one of the things that could have played a larger role had we had guaranteed income across the country for Canadians.
Tiff or Mark, do you want to comment on that?
What I'd say is we basically have it. The government has effectively rolled this out in a couple of weeks. We effectively have that. I think what is key to these programs is that you want to make sure that the money is getting to the most vulnerable people. And so one element of the program that I think makes sense is, it's layered. So first of all, they used existing programs like the child tax benefit, the GST credit. Those by definition are going to lower income people, getting the money to people who are most vulnerable. And then they've layered on some universal programs for really virtually anybody who's affected by this. We're going to learn a lot from this. And in the fullness of time, we can reflect on that. But, I think that the key thing in these programs is, don't send checks to everybody in Canada. Send checks to people who really need it, because giving everybody $1,000 isn't going to do much. The people who really need the money need a lot more than $1,000. So Hassan, me, and Mark, we don't need the $1,000. Make sure the people who get it really get enough so that they can get through this.
I have a question here that speaks to the longer term future, which I think is a good area for us to move into at the end of our conversation. What will the crisis mean for globalization in the future? Globalization already getting a bad name going into, will supply chains and the way that our businesses interact globally, will we see a change there?
I do think that that's probably, my general view, Elena, is that, and you heard me state earlier that, every time one of these crises takes place, people say the world will never be the same again. And invariably, things do revert and things do become normalized. But the point that you raised and the question raised about supply chains, I think in particular, this crisis has brought to bear the risks that we have in terms of the way global supply chains have been set up. I think it's a risk from a national perspective. We don't have a lot of capabilities. The U.S. doesn't have a lot of capabilities. Other countries don't have a lot of capabilities that they'd like to have right now. In terms of medical equipment, et cetera. And companies in the early stages of this crisis also found that they were much more vulnerable, for example, to China when China shut down and not being able to get critical components that they needed for their products. So, if the global financial crisis, the thing that really changed was the world's approach to leverage and the way that we thought about leverage in the financial system, I think this crisis will be, as you stated in your question, will really question the globalization of supply chains in particular. I think there's a lot of good that will come out of this from in terms of globalization. I believe that countries are going to work more closely together on these types of pandemic issues. I think researchers, as we work to vaccines and therapies, are working together across borders. But I do think any business leader has to rethink his or her supply chains after this crisis. And I think governments have to rethink that as a matter of public policy. That'll be the big thing, I think, that comes out of this in terms of change.
Elena,
I believe that, sorry, Tiff, go ahead.
Just to build on that, coming out of the global financial crisis, there was a real shift in finance, in financial services, to building resilience into the financial system. So much larger capital buffers, much larger liquidity buffers. And those are serving us very well today. I think this is going to, this focus on resilience is probably going to now expand to every business. Businesses, and we're guilty. I run a business school. We've been, preaching efficiency, driving efficiency, and that's been, but what we're seeing now is when things are super efficient, things are very tightly coupled. There's very little redundancy. And so when you have a big problem, you don't have surge capacity, you don't have buffers, you don't have any redundancy to absorb big negatives. So I think every business is going to be focused more on resiliency going forward and a little less on efficiency. Part of that will be looking at your supply chain, and is how resilient is my supply chain? And I think you will see some simplification of supply chains, but I think it's going to be much broader than that.
I think one of the issues that this crisis reinforced is the strength and the need for multilateralism. We cannot fight the pandemic around the world if countries are not cooperating and collaborating. We have the World Health Organization, and of course recognize the important role it has to play, but equally what countries can do to ensure that we're actually laboring in the same efforts to try to ensure we can actually stem the virus. Nobody would have believed when this virus began in China that where we would end up today. I think if we all anticipate where we're going to be today, how different the world could have looked in terms of the action that other governments could have done much earlier in terms of what we could have done to start preparing for it. But I think it reinforced that argument that multilateralism is more needed today than ever in history. And more importantly, I think we all can learn how we need to invest in those multilateral institutions and use them to the full extent that we can to ensure when the crisis comes, we're better prepared to ensure all of us can survive this. There are many parts of the world, of course, are still struggling because they haven't got the capacity as we do in Canada to respond to the virus, much less the healthcare system that's going to help their people deal with the crisis when they're infected in their own country. So I think we've got much to learn, but equally, I think it should reinforce the need for multilateralism around the world and how much we need to invest as Canadians in that system because it will serve us well in the long term.
So I'm hearing we may see a growing emphasis on multilateralism or a recognition of the benefits. We may see a change in our approach towards supply chains and perhaps in terms of business resilience and surge capacity. Many of us are also, I assume that most of the people in this audience are watching this from home and people are working at home. Any takeaways, any personal takeaways any of you want to share? Any assumptions about your own worlds that have changed in the last number of weeks?
Well, maybe a couple of things that I think will likely come out of this. You mentioned we're all working from home. I think we are all dying to go back to work and getting together with our colleagues, and we do all thrive on human interaction. Having said that, this shift to online didn't start with the pandemic. It's been going on for a long time, and this probably will reinforce it. I think we're all getting more inventive and doing things online, and we're all learning a lot of new tricks, and new things are getting invented. So my guess is, while I do think, I agree with Mark, we're all dying to go out with our friends, go to a restaurant, get back to work. I do think the online world, this will accelerate the shift to online world. I also think, while I very much hope this is, there is a real recognition of the importance of multilateralism and, the complete failure to manage this thing globally, we need to take a much more global perspective. I do think, borders to some extent will thicken, or at least the management of borders will probably become more proactive than we've seen in the past.
I want to thank you all so much for your insights here into how this is likely to play out and what Canadians should be watching. I want to hand the the floor back over to Mike Van Soelen. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Elena. Thanks to all you who have watched this. First, I want to thank my panelists, Mark, Hassan, and Tiff. Really, the concept of an Empire Club event hasn't changed, whether we're virtual or we're in a room. It's putting really smart people on the stage or having them talk to you from their homes to unpack issues that are pressing. And certainly, COVID-19 is an unprecedented pandemic that we're all struggling to understand, and having bright folks able to dig in today to what it all means in economic terms means a lot to our audiences. Thanks so much to Elena, who's helped guide this discussion. We hope to have more of these discussions in the coming days and weeks as we all continue to self-isolate. Thank you very much for joining us. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.